relocated from there, and the people from that area who got employment might lose their employment as well. So that might be a double-edged, loss because of this poor observation. So he thinks that before drawing any conclusion on any issue, an investigator from a scientific point of view should explore the entire gamut or range of possibilities which might be there in causing anything. There are some very obvious factors which he calls common sense understanding, but there are hidden factors. He has to draw his conclusion based on all the factors gathered through deep observation and long observation. And he gives the example in the same process that quite possible that the people are suffering from lung disease because there might be other factors, and the other factors are hidden, like, for example, inequality, for example, growing rate of poverty, for example, contaminated water, for example, lack of medicine, for example, lack of, nutrient food, for example. So he thinks that there might be many factors, and once you gather all the factors together, then as an investigator, you are supposed to draw a conclusion. Otherwise, your conclusion would be unreliable. It might be partially reliable. So in order to minimize all these possibilities of committing errors, you have to take observation to a beyond particular limit, and at the same time, you have to read things beyond their appearance. So this is the second warning of the case study which he has given in order to exemplify the chances of error in scientific investigations. So I think somebody should read from there onwards. Yes, someone of you should read, please.
Should I start from the third paragraph of the unit 8?
Yes, read.
Okay. Both in collecting the original evidence and in carrying out subsequent experiments, a frequent cause of error is the fact that observations are not continued for a long enough time. This may lead not only to a failure to discovery. Sorry, sir, my voice is too much lagging here.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Someone of you should read.
My voice is repeating to me.
Sir,
Yes, read again. Someone else can help.
Yes, sir. Sir, I can read.
Yes, do.
From which industry?
आवाज नहीं आ रही.
Yes, because there are the nature of network changes from people to people. So one who has better network.
Both in collecting and
yes.
As the century developed, the increasing magnitude complexity of the problem to be solved and the growing interconnection of different disciplines made it impossible in many cases for the individual scientist to deal with the huge mass.
No, you are reading a different essay. We are far ahead of it. We are reading, doing some other essay. You are reading the previous one.
So let me start from the beginning.
Yes, from where you stopped on Saturday.
Both in collecting the original evidence and in carrying out subsequent experiments, a frequent cause of error is the fact that observations are not continued for a long enough time. This may lead not.
No, you should stop, please. Yes. Now, the third chance of error is this: that, for example, you are going to conduct an experiment. So you see, whether you conduct an experiment or you can, whether primarily you conduct an observation, if your observation is not made during, to the required duration of time, or you haven't conducted your experiment to the required duration of time, then it might result sometime in a very fatal kind of error at the same time. I will give the example. For instance, you will find a better example in this pandemic. For example, this different types of vaccines are competing against each other. I think you are familiar. This competition in the vaccine you see is because of political region, because different countries you see claim that their vaccine is more effective and they are likely to bring it sooner than the other. One of the reasons, and the primary factor you see, is commercial. It has nothing to do with the scientific efficiency of a society. It has to do with economy and politics. Because if a country brings it quickly and is able to vaccinate its citizens earlier than the rest of the world, then it means that the country's leadership will get certain kind of political acknowledgement, number one. And the country would be able to exercise certain degree of superiority over the neighbors at the same time. I mean, this is what they call in international relation, that is having certain kind of political clout over them. So here you see this writer want to say that due to competition in certain economic activities related with scientific experiments, sometimes there might be intense competition. I have given the example of medicine. Similarly, there are competition in other sectors of economy as well, where you see certain steps of experiments are flouted, they are violated at the same time, they are sidelined at the same time, ignored at the same time, and the scientists you see under the pressure of those who fund that research, they put pressure on them to bring it as soon as possible to the market. So he thinks that in certain technical areas, there may not be some problem. For example, in automobile industry or telecommunication industry, for example, the instrument might be less effective or it might not work properly, but that does not risk someone's life. But I think that if this kind of competition in agricultural sciences, for example, or in medicine, for example, then it might be very fatal for the rest of the people who will consume or who will use that, product. So his argument is that if any experiment or any observation is not carried out till the required duration of time, that is, you try to bypass time or the amount of time which is required for conducting an experiment, instead of that, you try to go through the shortcut, for example. So we think that in certain areas, it might be very fatal, it might be very dangerous at the same time. So this is in fact his argument, which is talking, which he thinks is the third factor. Now, this one you see, which is talking, is quite often occurs these days, particularly because of political greed or economic greed. So this is something which is very common. For example, in order to enhance production, these high yielding seeds in agriculture, which magnify the quantum of production at the same time, they are not very healthy at the same time and not very good for the health. But there are people who keep on justifying it simply because they earn so much money at the same time. For example, they can write a very good review in the newspaper, or they can advertise through mass media, particularly electronics media, that the food is good and this and that. But from health point of view, if you apply a very rigorous parameter, that may not be very healthy for the body at the same time, but they somehow justify it. So he thinks that this kind of activity, you see, sometimes causes a very fatal, error. And in those areas where biology is concerned, it might cause the life of the person at the same time. So this is his warning, which comes out of the economic greed in the scientist. Yes. Yes, now you should read the next line.
This may lead not only to a failure to discover positive items, example, Lemonnier's failure to recognize that Uranus was a new planet, not a fixed star, but may also result in important negative aspects of the investigation remaining undiscovered. In applied science, this latter error may have disastrous consequences, as in the case of thalidomide drugs, cancer-inducing industrial chemicals, etc.
So he has given certain example. If you are not conducting your observation related with astrophysics or astrophysical phenomenon, So even then you can make some errors at the same time in your observation, and the data which you'll gather may not be sufficient, or it may not be valid data, for example, or reliable data, for example. And on the other hand, he gives the example of medicine, that is drug, where he thinks that it might be very fatal. For example, requirement of conducting experiment is 3 years, but you try to bypass certain steps of the research and you try to complete it within 1 year or 1.5 years. So naturally, he thinks that this, speed which you induce in the process of your experiment or observation may be very dangerous. And I think this aspect is known to you also, because you people see things all the time, that intense competition in pharmaceutical companies, for example, these days brings out certain medicines which are not very healthy. So, and there are no doubt independent and autonomous institutions to check and balance, but even those institutions can come under pressure of certain wings of the government, and they might allow certain kind of things which should not be there. So he thinks that that is something which is in fact a very important thing, and scientists should not come under the pressure of anyone. They should follow the logic of science rather than the logic of politics. Yes. Yes, read the next line, please. You people should note down the things, because noting is something which is a fundamental skill which you have to learn. And note down when after the lecture is finished, whenever you have time, then make detailed notes, so that in this way you would be able to have your, sufficient information and enlarge on those points, elaborate on those points, so that when you get a question, you can be in a position to write your answer with required details. Yes, read.
Another well-known error in experimental sets is lack of adequate controls. See Unit 3. Thus, a few years ago, it was widely believed that a certain vaccine could prevent the common cold. Since in the experiments, the vaccinated subjects reported a decrease in incidence of colds compared with the previous year. Yet later, more strictly controlled experiments failed to support this conclusion, which could have been due to the misinterpretation of chance results. This error is often caused by a failure to test a sufficient number of subjects, inadequate sampling, a disadvantage which affects medical and psychological research in particular.
All right. So you see what you want to say, that, for example, you are conducting a trial in medicine and you have to vaccinate, for example, entire population, which goes, for example, for 200 millions. All right. And you are conducting an experiment. At the stage of trial, you simply you simply vaccinate a very small sample. A small sample means that is 100 people or 200 people or 500 people, and you chosen it not randomly, but you chosen people who are young, for example, and you vaccinated, and you realize that it works well. And on that assumption, you started vaccinating the entire population from a child up to an old man. So naturally, he thinks that in such a case where you haven't experimented on sufficient number of people, your conclusion may not be valid. And if you approve this kind of experiment and you release the drug, for example, that might be a disaster at the same time. So he thinks that unless you have sufficient information when you conduct experiment, or you have put under trial a sufficient amount of people, number of people, your conclusion may not be valid. So he thinks that not simply the required duration of time should be followed in a scientific observation and experiment, but the required number of trials should also be followed. The required number of people should also be, incorporated in the data. So he thinks that the insufficiency of data and cutting short the time, both are very dangerous factors. And at the same time, as I told you, that both these things are violated quite often. in those countries where the government is very strong and the institutions are very poor. Otherwise, certain countries, they are not followed in this way. I mean, if they are going to draw a conclusion out of an experiments, so they would, in fact, vaccinate sufficient number of people of varying groups so that their conclusion should be valid. And after that, they will permit for or give sanction for, vaccination, mass vaccination. And he thinks that similar things should be followed during observation also, that the required time should be given. It is not like that an observation which should be conducted in 1 year and you in fact try to do it in 3 months and 6 months because of the competition and political pressure. So he thinks that both are the chances, and that the errors which will result, he thinks might be very fatal at the same time. One thing which you should note, what in fact he wants to say is this, that any natural phenomenon, it has its own cycle. You should not try to bypass it. And he thinks that any strategy to reduce the required amount of time is a political corruption, which one should avoid. He thinks that the moment you try to bypass slowness of life, you lose something very significant in life. And you also know that anything which takes more time is likely to have the better degree of or higher degree of perfection than the work which is done very quickly. I will give an example from gastronomy as well, which I think you understand well. Gastronomy means that is the science of food. You see, when you cook food for a very long time, by using foods which are natural. Suppose that in a traditional family, the family cooks food, for example, by using natural foods, and the food is cooked in 2 to 3 hours, sometimes 4 hours even. The taste of that food would be very different from the food which is prepared through a mechanical device, for example, in lesser amount of time. Now, how the taste would be different, it depends on your sensor. If your sensors are working well, you can distinguish which food with the same ingredient is different and better than the other foods. Now, you should also know that anything which tastes better will suit your organism well than the other kind of food. For example, the food, for example, which you don't like for more than one factors, if you forcefully feed yourself, you will develop certain kind of problems at the same time. So he thinks that everything in this world requires certain amount of natural time. You should not bypass the time. If you bypass the time, it is likely to have some kind of side effect. Like, for example, if the growth of a particular species of animal is 3 years, and you try to bring to the same weight that animal in 6 months, so naturally there is a violation of time. Apparently, people might justify that it has no side effect, but it will have. Because violation of time, you see, is something which is, in fact, it causes many, many problems. It is quite possible that one may not be able to notice those emerging symptoms of problem, but it will definitely have some impact. So he thinks that violation of time, or the violation of the duration of time, and the violation of the quantity of data which you require, both these factors somehow result into fatal kind of problems, which a scientist should try to avoid to the best possible extent. I think you have come to the end of this essay. Yes, I think you have reached the end of the essay, or a few lines. All right. This was essay unit 8, I
Few
think.
lines are left, I guess.
It was unit 8, I think.
Yes, sir.
Right. What is the next unit after that?
I think
Just
one
one
paragraph
paragraph.
left.
Few lines are left.
One
One
paragraph?
paragraph is left.
Yes, then you could read out. Yes, read that one.
Error in measurements, particularly where complicated instruments are used, are common. They may arise through lack of skill in operator or may be introduced through defects in apparatus itself. Furthermore, it should be borne in mind that apparently minor changes in laboratory conditions, such as variation in electrical current or failure to maintain atmospheric conditions constant, may disturb the accuracy of various items of equipment and hence have a adverse influence on the experiment or series of experiments as a whole. In addition, such errors tend to be cumulative.
Right. So he thinks that he has pointed to two more factors. I mean, in fact, factor number fifth, there are two, integrated factors. One is he thinks that suppose that you are conducting an experiment and you are not able to handle the medium. Naturally, you see in scientific researches, you have to take help of so many people. For example, sometimes you conduct research in chemistry, but you require somebody from a statistics department, or for example, you require someone from biotech department. In this way, you see there is an internal collaboration. You might send the sample to them and they will conduct the experiment and give the data to you, and you can use it for some other purposes in your sciences. This is what happens every day. Now he thinks that suppose that you are conducting an experiment and you have the instrument and you need not to send the sample to somebody else for conducting an experiment. Like for example, in electronics, you might send your sample somewhere like IIT Delhi, for example, or the Tata Institute of Fundamental Researches, for example, because you think that there they have the instruments and they can draw the conclusion, give the data to you, which you can use for your own purpose. Now, and suppose that you have the machine, you have the instrument, so you are not sending it, and you think that you can conduct the experiment in your own lab itself, and you incidentally do not know how to handle the instrument. Like for example, you want to know the chemical composition of something, you have to prepare a palette, or you have to develop crystal, for example, and you require help of someone who is working in spectroscopy, for example, in physics. And suppose that you have the spectroscopic machine, for example, in your own lab, in electronics, for example, you go there and you conduct experiment and you don't have the help of someone, you are not assisted by some technician, for example, and you are handling that machine, whose operation itself is slightly complicated. Quite possible that you will make certain kind of errors, and that error can result into fatal kind of problems. This is one example. Another example, he thinks that you are conducting experiment, and because of the lack of the instruments and some other things, you are not in a position to conduct it properly, smoothly, or reliably, for example, and you still keep on doing it. So he thinks that this kind of problem, that is inadequate instruments or inadequate knowledge of that instrument, can result into certain kind of problem. Another one is he's talking about the atmospheric balance. Like, for example, in biotechnology, in other branches of life sciences, when they conduct an experiment, their lab, you see, is very sophisticated. They have to seal everything. There is nothing can come from outside, and they have to maintain a particular temperature when they conduct the experiment, because the fluid might get affected or anything else can happen. So they have to maintain that atmospheric balance. Even in some other sciences, in your sciences, for example, sometime it will happen as you go to final year. Suppose that there is something which is affecting the atmospheric balance, then naturally the experiment which you are conducting will get automatically affected. So he thinks that these two factors, inability to handle the instruments and inability to maintain the required temperature, for example, can sometimes affect your result. Therefore, the research is likely to have some kind of problem with itself, which a scientist who is more conscious should avoid these two possibilities. So there are 5 factors which he has enumerated. In the 5th one, there are 2 factors integrated. All these factors you should keep in your mind. Also try to elaborate them. Also try to critically examine them. And also you can bring some example from your daily experiences in order to elaborate something. Like, for example, as instance of technology, which I think you should not remain absolutely ignorant of economy. Economy is something which is very important. in fact, has a natural bonding with technology, because whatever you do in technology, if you misunderstand the behavior of economics, you are likely to make some big blunder, for instance. So here you see, you might write something for your sake and in order to test yourself how intense competition in a capitalist economy somehow affects certain technological product. I mean, understanding at the same time, which you can use for your later understanding as well, because whatever you are learning at this stage, they can be used for other purposes later on in your life, because at this stage, you may not be able to understand the gravity of what you are learning and what is taught to you. But these things are very important, which you can extend into any kind of inquiry and understanding. So here you can think that how human greed, economy, you see, has a lot to do with human greed. How human greed somehow affects the most sophisticated kind of researches in, I mean, sciences. I have given you a sufficient example because you are living during this unusual time of pandemic. You know that there is an intense competition in bringing medicine, and governments, you see, the amount of time which they have and the amount of money which they have invested for the production of vaccine is no less than the amount of time and energy now they are investing in gaining people's belief and is restoring people's faith in the medicine, because you find advertisement is going on all the time in the same way as advertisement going on for certain kind of Cadbury. The Cadbury is not a necessary thing for you. That's why advertisement is there, and the Cadbury production and the money which is charged on invested for advertisement is almost equal. But we had never thought that a medicine would also require some advertisement. This is because, you see, it has been brought by every government everywhere by violating certain steps of research because of this competition, or they might say it is expediency because we are living in a very compelling time and we cannot follow all the rules of all the protocols of drug production, so we have to violate some of them. Whatever way they go to justify it, but it is giving a very good example of what the writer is talking about in this essay. So there are certain aspects of making errors and their consequences, adverse consequences, you can explore, and by bringing data from your daily life at the same time. In this way, agri-science, for example, what they call agricultural science, even there they have been violating in order to maximize and enhance production. They are using high yielding seeds and intensive, use of fertilizers and all the things. Any grain which is produced in this way, they might justify that it's healthy, but it may not be healthy as much as it should be. Similarly, the fruit, that the horticulture, for example, will find that in order to maximize and get a lot of produce, they use so many poisonous and insecticides at the same time in order to have fresh and good looking food at the same time. So these things, you see, are looking very beautiful, but at the same time, they lack something. They are bound to be less nutrient, and at the same time, they might have a minor side effect also, which may not be realized immediately, but that might be there. These issues, you see, will come when I'll teach you Time Machine by H.G. Wells, where this kind of problem will emerge in a very remarkable way, which I think you should keep in your mind, this relation that when you violate certain steps of research and simply to enhance production or maximize production or to quicken production, for example, in any field, be it agriculture or drug, because both of them you see directly consumed by men. That's why I'm bringing these two examples to you. So what would be the side effect on human physiology? The human physiology, you see, it might not cause into a disease, but it might affect your physiology gradually. One of the examples which I can point out here at the end of this essay, for example, you might notice these days that every family almost has sufficient things to eat and to feed its siblings or the children. And you notice that with the maximization of production, hunger and poverty have been reduced in every society. And these days, people you see are wearing good clothes at the same time. But you might notice that the children which are born in the families, every family you will find that most of them look very ugly. I'm not using ugly in terms of skin color. I'm using the word ugly in a geometrical sense. You will find that the parents are relatively tall. They are looking handsome also, though they were poor at that time. But their children, you see, look slightly deformed. It is in the sense of deformity. I'm using the word ugliness. Deformity of many kinds. They might be stunted. It is quite possible they are remaining stunted there, despite the fact that the family is rich. They don't have the proper physical balance at the same time. These are called different types of physiological abnormality, which are not considered as disease, but they create certain kind of bad feelings in society. This theme, you see, H.G. Wells has taken up in one of his books, which I'll teach you, Time Machine. That is how in the age of great prosperity and economic growth, there has been a growing deformity at physiological level of human race. That is a significant theme in that book, which I will take up after a month with you. So I think as you will keep on reading the book, which I ask you that all of you should read those two novels, so that when I'll begin, you should be able to understand what exactly is talked about. So I think we have come to end of this essay, or is still few lines left?
So there are two left.
Paragraph on that.
Yes, finish it. Yes, somebody should read till the end. Yes, who is reading? Roll number 21. Yes.
Yes, sir. So finally, emotions in the observer can be one of the most dangerous source of error. This may cause the researcher to overstress or attach too much importance to irrelevant details because of their usefulness in supporting a theory to which he is personally inclined. Conversely, evidence disproving the view held may be ignored for similar reasons. Even routine matters such as recording of data may be subject to emotional interference and should be carefully checked.
Right. Now you see, at the end, he is given a very interesting factor. And he said that emotion sometime, that is the factor number 6, which he thinks can be the most dangerous. And that is, he thinks that if you are making observation, or you are conducting experiment, or you are gathering data, for example, or sometimes you generate data, for example, in all these operations, your emotion can play the most dangerous role. Now, you should be reminded of your first essay, where I had told you that since man is not the naturally designed scientific instrument, therefore, neither the instrument's design can be absolutely scientific, nor its application can be absolutely scientific, because it is man who is doing everything. So I think that sometimes your emotion, you see, can play a very important role. Now, let us look at a very primary level. In your statistics, for example, in mathematics, for example, your emotion cannot play a much role, because these sciences, you see, are relatively emotion neutrals. They're neutral, but at the same time, their application, for example, can be very much manipulated. Like, for example, you know that when you make 2 and 2, then it makes 4, all right. But when this 4 is used in statistics for generation of certain kind of economic data, it can be manipulated. Like, for example, you might be reading newspaper and listening news every day. Governments of every country of the world talks about 2% GDP, 3% GDP, or 2.5% growth, 6.8 growth, or double-digit growth, for example. Now, you see, this measurement, you see, can be manipulated in more than one ways, and they are quite often manipulated. And How many people understand the accuracy of this kind of measurement? Very few people who in fact works in that domain. Otherwise, even somebody knows mathematics, he cannot understand. For him, 2.5 is something very definite quantity. It can be understood simply by those people who works in that domain. Similarly, for example, there are certain areas where emotion can play a role. Like, for example, if you work in life sciences, suppose you are a zoologist, you are making an observation. The beauty of certain animal species, you see, can mislead you in a way that you are defining the nature of the animal's existence from a wrong angle. Similarly, if you are a botanist, for example, you are making observation of the, that is this entire flora and fauna, for example. Quite often that you might make some kind of mistake or you might suffer from certain kind of delusion because this entire spectacle fascinates you so much. Similarly, if you are a astrophysicist, you are going to understand the making of this universe, and you might having a kind of superstitious mind, which is quite often ingrained at the bottom of human mind. Quite possible that you draw a conclusion which is mistaken. Or, for example, you work in life sciences where you want to study the genesis of human race. You might have some kind of prejudice against black people or colored people, and you might generate data artificially in order to support your thesis if you are a follower of it, or if you are fascinated by white race, for example. So he thinks that there are certain areas where, because of your emotion, your biasness, your personal and particular feelings and inclinations and dispositions, they might disturb your observation, they might disturb your accumulation of data, they might disturb your experiment also, and eventually they might disturb the entire fabric of your conclusion also. So you think that the emotion can play multiple roles, and there are different sets of emotions, which I have exemplified to you. It might work in terms of prejudice, it might work in terms of your belief, it might work in terms of your temperament, it might work in terms of your society as well. So there are different ways in which emotion plays its role, and in different realm, sphere, and areas, it works differently. But one has to minimize its role to affect your observation or to affect your experiment. So he thinks that a scientist must be alert all the time. Otherwise, he would not be able to draw any conclusion. So I think you have understood this essay. Yes. I hope that you got all the points related with this essay.
Yes, sir.
All right. What is the next unit?
Sir, one paragraph left.
One paragraph is still left.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, summarize.
Yes. I mean, read that one.
To sum up, the multiple possibilities of error are present at every stage of a scientific investigation, and constant vigilance and the greatest foresight must be exercised in order to minimize or eliminate them. Additional errors are, of course, connected with faculty reasoning. What so widespread and serious are the consequences that may arise from this source that they deserve a separate treatment in the following unit.
Right. So he is going to discuss in the following unit, means in the next one. What he wants to say is that, number 7, he gives a warning. And the warning is that he thinks that the experiment and observations are in fact very complex process. Even if you are technically correct, you minimize all the chances of errors, you control your emotions, you have very accurate observer, you are able to minimize the mistakes in, for example, in measurement, or some other possibilities of error, you give the full duration of time to the experiment. He thinks that if you follow all these parameters very well, all the protocols of your experiments and observations very well, he thinks that there are mistakes, chances of making errors, because there are certain things over which you have little control. So he thinks that your foresight means that is your ability to see things beyond appearance, and he thinks that your wisdom, these things can play some important role to minimize them to the degree zero. And if a person is foresighted, if a person has experience, if a person can read beyond the line, quite possible that he would be able to minimize chances of error to the minimum. But he thinks there would always be certain possibilities which can affect. Therefore, you should be extremely cautious and use your intelligence, use your experience in order to minimize them. That is, the writer has not said that there is any protocol which is absolutely correct, because I think that since human being itself is not absolutely scientific, therefore nothing can be absolutely scientific. Yes. I have discussed with you a sufficient number of essays. If you have any questions, any problem, you can ask me. There is no problem.
Sir, what is meant by inadequate sampling? There is a question number 8 in comprehension.
Yes, inadequate sampling means that sampling means collection of data. Inadequate means that is you do not have conducted your experiment on the sufficient number of people. I give an example from vaccination, for example. Suppose that you work in a biochemistry lab which is producing vaccine, and you conduct an experiment on certain amount of people, like for example 100 young people, and you found your result 80% correct, and you draw this conclusion that this medicine is very effective. So you think that this sampling is very inadequate. You have to gather data from a variety of people and from variety of regions, different age groups at the same time, different regional groups at the same time. So I think that unless an experiment is conducted sufficiently, the data which you will bring out to prove your result will be invalid. So this is what he means, the inadequate sampling.
Okay, sir.
You see, man by nature, always try to follow shortcut route. He never tries to see the entire picture. If you look at the entire picture of anything in this world, your perception will automatically change. We always take half of the view of reality, or sometimes we do not even take view of the half of the view of reality. We try to look in a glance. Everything looks very beautiful simply in a glance. The moment you stay your gaze at anything for a long period of time, its ugliness automatically becomes very apparent to you. Whenever you travel in Indian train, you know that your train, the coach in which you are sitting is very comfortable. If your coach in which you are sitting is very comfortable, and the moment you drew the curtain, when you draw the curtain, you realize that the outside of world is so beautiful. It's green, it's yellow, flowers and this and that. Water even looks very beautiful. It's a flow and rhythm. But the moment you put your foot outside of the compartment, you automatically realize the ugliness of the world. Everything you see looks very beautiful when you look from a distance. The more closer you come to it, and the longer you stay with it, it will automatically show certain aspect of its existence which might repel you. So this is, something which is very important in sciences, that you cannot draw a conclusion simply in a glance. Everything looks very beautiful simply in a glance. I think you understand.
Yes.
Right. Never draw a conclusion even of a person. For example, you meet a person who is your host and your guest, and by a few minutes interaction, you draw this conclusion that he's a very good person or she's a very good person. You are likely to be misled. Unless you continue your interaction over a long period of time, either with a human reality or with a physical reality or with a natural reality or with a social reality. Your conclusion is bound to be falsified. You have to stay with it during the required period of time. And you realize that the beginning of your understanding and the ending of your understanding are diametrically opposed. Everything you see looks beautiful only in a glance. Therefore, everything looks beautiful simply in the beginning. If something looks beautiful even in the ending, it means that there is really something beautiful about that thing. I'm using the word beautiful in a positive sense, that anything of which you have a very positive view, you take this positive view, you develop this positive view simply when you take things in your glance. The moment and close observation, you must know, stay for a required period of time, as the writer has said. So the moment you stay with that thing for a very long time, you realize it very well. I think you got my point, what I say. Right. So this unit marks its end, I hope, and this is unit number 8 or 9.
8 unit.
Right. Move to the next one.
Straight and crooked thinking.
No, this is not that one. It is for your reading. I mean, it is not supposed to be taught by me. You can read it. It's good. Move to the next one.
So next,
Yes, yes.
Science and the future.
Even not. This is for your reading.
So this is end.
All right. The essays which are there after that, you are supposed to read it up to essay number 13, 1-3.
so we have done only 9 essays.
Yes, these 9 essay up to 9 were supposed to be taught by me line by line. The rest of the essays are for your supplementary, reading, and they are interconnected. So, for example, the crooked thinking, naturally a thinking which is not proper, which is not scientific, there are different factors which lead to the thinking being distorted. Crook means distorted. So he thinks that these units you see are interconnected. Whatever, in fact, I have revealed the foundation of all these essays. All these topics you see are dealt with in greater details in the rest of the essays which you are supposed to read. You get my point?
No, sir.
Oh, yes, one of you should see me in my chamber tomorrow, because there are some other essays which I'll find in the book. I might recommend you to go through. So one of you can get the book from the bank issued in his name or her name, and can bring to me. I can identify, because last time when he came to me and I had pointed out certain essays to be a photocopy, but he couldn't do it completely. He did it up to essay number 9 or 10, something like that. And you are supposed to read essay number 13 also, which is your first supplementary reading. But at least you should have the material for supplementary reading. So I think I will ask someone of you to come to my chamber, and along with the book should get issued from the book bank. I can mark those essays and you can get the photocopy, and after that he can.
Offline classes started.
Yes, yes.
Sir, offline classes are not started.
Not offline. I'm asking that one of you can come to the book bank, as someone of you did last time, and he can get the book issue, can come to my chamber with the book. I can mark the essays for your supplementary reading. This is what I say. Anyone who is from Aligarh itself? I mean, you get my point, what I say. I mean, you are getting what I say. Unmute yourself.